If you want to make the most of your Posca markers, then stick around because I'm going to share with you everything I've learned over the past 10 plus years of using Posca paint pens. We'll cover things like surfaces, blending, refilling, varnishing, and more. Let's begin! As you know, Poscas can be used on a vast array of tantalizing surfaces, but some surfaces are better than others. If you find that your Poscas aren't sticking well to your surface, then the secret ingredient might be to add a layer of gesso. Applying a base coat of gesso helps prepare your surface so that you can get the most out of your Poscas by enhancing the coverage, vibrancy, and adhesion of the Posca paint onto your surface. You'll want to use acrylic gesso, which is made up of pigment, acrylic resin, and a filler suspended in water. You can use acrylic gesso on a wide variety of surfaces, including both porous surfaces and non-porous surfaces. So what does gesso actually do? Well, Posca markers contain acrylic paint, and gesso essentially makes it much easier for the acrylic paint to stick to different types of surfaces. For example, without gesso, Posca paint can easily flake off of non-porous surfaces like glass or plastic or metal. On porous surfaces, like paper, wood, or canvas, Posca paint will sink into the fibers, which can cause the paint to look relatively washed out. The color of the surface can even change or dull the colors of your Poscas. Here's an example on cardboard. On the left, I used my Posca directly on the cardboard. On the right, I primed the cardboard first with a coat of gesso and let it dry, and then applied my Posca. Notice what a huge difference it makes in terms of vibrancy and opacity. When there's a layer of gesso on top of your porous surface, the Posca paint rests on top of the gesso, giving you much better coverage. This actually saves you paint, which saves you money, because it means you can usually get a really vibrant, opaque color with only one coat of Posca paint. Otherwise, it could take you 2 or even 3 or 4 coats to achieve the same look on an ungessoed porous surface. Gesso can also help smooth out your surface, providing you with a more predictable and consistent texture that makes your Poscas much easier to use. For one thing, a smoother surface is kinder on your nibs. Posca nibs can get worn out and frayed if you frequently use them on rough surfaces. I mostly use white gesso because it provides a bright surface that helps the colors really pop. You can also buy black gesso or clear gesso, or create your own colored gesso by mixing your gesso with any color of acrylic paint. The only downside of using gesso is that it is an extra step and you have to buy the gesso as well as a paintbrush, and then clean the paintbrush when you're done. You also have to wait for the gesso to dry before painting on it with Poscas. But in my experience, depending on the surface you want to paint on, it's often well worth the extra step. To gesso your surface, make sure the surface is clean and dry before you begin, which is something you should do whether or not you're using gesso. Gesso typically dries hard, so to prevent cracking, it's better to brush on thin layers of gesso, even if this means applying multiple layers to achieve enough coverage. Just remember to let each layer dry fully before you apply another layer, and make sure it's fully dry before you start painting on it with your Poscas. Since gessoing your surface is an extra step, you might be wondering how necessary it really is. I'd say it all depends on how you use Poscas and what kinds of surfaces you use them on. Gesso certainly isn't essential. I don't use gesso every time. But if vibrancy and opacity are important to you, then it can be a really useful step. And it also provides a stable base that will help your Posca art last much longer. So if those factors are important to you, then it is worth getting a bottle of gesso and a paintbrush and trying it out for yourself. If you don't plan to use gesso, then it's really important that you pick the right surface for your artwork, because the kind of surface that you use will have a dramatic impact on your experience of using Poscas. There are so many different surfaces that you can paint on with Poscas, and each one has its own pros and cons depending on your art style, as well as how much preparation and time you want to put into it. I'm definitely not an expert on every single one of these surfaces, but I can offer some general principles for you to keep in mind. In my previous tip, I touched on the 2 most important factors when considering surfaces for Posca markers: surface texture, rough or smooth, and porosity. In other words, will the paint soak into the surface or dry on top? For most people, I recommend surfaces that are somewhat smooth, but not perfectly smooth, and a little porous. This way, your nibs will last longer, you won't waste paint, the paint will adhere well with decent longevity, and you'll be able to blend and layer your colors. Surfaces that fall into this category are smooth wood, which you can buy fairly cheaply in art supply stores, smooth canvas, which you can get in the form of pads and panels, as well as the traditional stretch canvas, and paper, which I'll discuss more in a moment. I also highly recommend Ampersand Clayboard, which works incredibly well with Poscas. Clayboard does cost more, but it has an amazingly smooth texture, so the Poscas glide right on. Another huge bonus is that Clayboard doesn't require any gesso or prep, so it's ready for painting as soon as you unwrap it. You can also get fantastic results with very smooth, non-porous surfaces like glass, plastic, and glazed ceramic. The paint goes on with very little friction on these surfaces, which is splendid for blending and expressive strokes. However, layering one color of paint on top of another can sometimes be a bit more difficult since the paint doesn't adhere as well to smooth, non-porous surfaces. When you paint on a non-porous surface, I recommend that you seal or varnish your artwork to help protect the paint from getting chipped or rubbed off. I'll talk about varnishing later in this video. So we've talked about smooth, non-porous surfaces. Now let's talk about the opposite. You can still get good results from rough, porous surfaces, such as stone, fabric, rough wood, and rough canvas. But be prepared to use up more paint, wear down your nibs faster, and have a harder time blending. But these surfaces are great for layering and can have better longevity. Now let's dive deeper into one of the most asked about surfaces, paper. There are two main considerations when it comes to buying paper for Poscas: thickness and texture. Firstly, you need a paper that is thick enough to handle a wet media like acrylic paint without warping, buckling, or bleeding through. Look for products that say they're suitable for use with wet media or mixed media. Watercolor paper can also be a good choice. Secondly, you don't want a paper that is too textured or soft because your Posca nibs will tear up the fibers and cause pilling. Some artists actually don't seem to mind when this happens, but others, like me, find it rather annoying and less than ideal. I recommend looking for paper that's labeled as smooth or hot-pressed or fine grain. You might also get good results with a medium textured paper, which is often labeled as regular, vellum, or cold press. Currently, my top two favorite papers for painting on with Poscas is Yupo and Strathmore Smooth Bristol paper. Yupo is a synthetic paper that works wonderfully with Posca paint because it's super smooth, doesn't pill, won't warp, and makes blending so much easier. Yupo is non-absorbent, which gives you more time to blend your colors. The downside, of course, is that because the paint takes longer to dry, you have to be careful not to smudge it, and you do need to wait longer to apply additional layers. I also really love using smooth Bristol paper with my Poscas. It's thick and strong enough to resist pilling and warping, and its texture is nice and smooth, so the paint goes on super duper well. Posca dries much more quickly on smooth Bristol paper than it does on Yupo, so that's another bonus that makes it perfect for layering. Posca paints don't bleed through either paper, so that's another excellent bonus. If you have a favorite paper that you like using with other media, then feel free to test the paper to see how well it holds up to your particular art style with using Poscas. Take note of whether the paper pills, or if the paint warps the paper or bleeds through. It's definitely worth a try. Ultimately, whatever surfaces you're interested in, I strongly encourage you to experiment and see what works best for you. The most basic way to use Posca paint pens is to lay colors down side by side. But to take your art up a notch, one of the best ways to add complexity to your Posca art is by layering. Poscas contain acrylic paint, so once the paint dries, it stays dry, so you can paint on top of it without reactivating the layer underneath. This means you can apply many layers of color on top of one another to create really cool effects and designs. That's how I painted this detailed rock mandala. You can see exactly how I painted this step by step in my rock painting video here on YouTube. Here are even more examples of what you can create by layering Posca colors on top of one another. If you want each layer of paint to be distinct and separate from one another with clear edges, like this example, then be sure to let each layer dry completely before you add more colors on top. Wet paint is shiny, so you can tell the paint is dry when it's no longer shiny and instead has a matte appearance. Waiting for the paint to dry can slow you down, so if you want, you can speed up the drying process by using a hairdryer. I usually just work strategically, so while waiting for a wet area to dry, I just work on a different part of the artwork or work on multiple artworks at the same time. If your bottom layer isn't dry, then when you add paint on top, the colors will bleed and mix into each other. Depending on your art style, you might like this effect, especially if you want to blend your colors, which we'll talk about in the next tip. Blending your Poscas is another way to create some really cool effects. Instead of hard, distinct edges like this, you can overlap your colors while the paint is still wet to create a smoother appearance. You can also use your finger or a paintbrush to blend the wet paint together. Acrylic paint dries quickly, so if you want to blend your colors, you need to work quickly to blend the paint while it's still wet. For blending Poscas, I like to use Yupo paper. It has a non-absorbent surface, so the paint stays wet for longer than it would on regular paper. This feature makes it easier to blend. To blend Poscas, some artists like to use a paintbrush, or even mix Posca paint on a palette and then apply it to their surface. That's totally fine if you enjoy that process, but if you want to do a lot of blending and get smooth results, then I think it makes more sense to buy actual acrylic paints or even gouache or watercolor to create your blended layers. I'm someone who's used acrylic paints a lot, and in terms of creating smooth blends, it's just way easier to use acrylic paint from a jar or tube mixed with water or acrylic medium to create smooth blends rather than trying to blend Poscas. Plus, it's more cost-effective because you'll get a lot more acrylic paint in a jar or tube than you would in a Posca marker. So one idea is that you could use acrylics, gouache, or watercolor to create your bottom blended layers, and then use your Poscas on top for adding extra layers and details or line work that's easier to achieve with a pen. In my opinion, the main appeal of Poscas is that you can use them like a pen or a marker without needing extra tools like a brush and palette. I like that convenience, and I like not having to clean up any paintbrushes when I'm done. But ultimately, it's up to you, because there are a lot of people who really enjoy the process of blending paint markers, and they do create some really cool stuff that way. So definitely feel free to experiment and see which methods you prefer the best. Instead of blending your Poscas to create shading or gradients, you can use various drawing techniques to achieve a somewhat similar effect. On the left is the kind of blending I showed you in the previous tip. In the middle, I used a stippling technique to gradually go from light pink to dark red. On the right, I used a hatching technique to also achieve a gradation of color. Although these techniques don't create a smooth transition from one color to another, the colors blend together optically, resulting in a harmonious appearance. Instead of just lines and dots, you can also use other shapes to create a transition from one color to another color. In this example, I colored in a base layer and let it dry, and then I drew organic shapes and circles on top of the bottom layer to help the colors flow into one another, creating a visual transition of color. Techniques like stippling, hatching, and cross-hatching are usually more associated with drawing rather than painting. But Poscas are like a cross between a drawing tool and a painting tool, which means you can also use these techniques to express your creative vision. Because you hold Posca markers just like you would hold a pen, it does feel a lot like drawing, even though you're working with paint. Another great way to use Poscas like a drawing tool is to add line work on top of an underpainting. For example, lay down some color, and then when it dries, use a contrasting color to add some definition on top. Black is perfect for this, but depending on your artwork, you can also use white or any other color that stands out against the other colors. If you're enjoying this video and finding it useful, please tap the like button. Subscribe to my channel to see more of my art videos, and let me know in the comments if you have any Posca questions that I can help you with. This line work is often the perfect finishing touch because it unifies your entire artwork. You probably already know how to prime your Posca paint marker when you first open it, by shaking it and pressing the nib repeatedly on a spare piece of paper until the paint starts to flow. But priming your Poscas isn't something you only do once when the marker is new. The thing is, when you don't use your Posca paint markers for a few days or weeks, it's normal for the paint in your pens to separate and for the nib to dry out a little. So whenever you sit down to create a new artwork, before you start using your Poscas, it's a really good idea to get in the habit of quickly shaking and priming your Posca markers on a spare piece of paper before using them on your artwork. Sometimes you might need to reprime your paint markers several times throughout a single session, and that's pretty normal too, to keep the paint flowing. If you ever notice the paint isn't flowing well, that's a sign that it's time to prime. And always remember to prime your paint pen on a spare piece of paper. Never ever prime your Posca on your actual artwork, because you never know when a huge blob of paint might accidentally pour out of the nib and spoil your artwork. Sealing or varnishing your Posca artwork will help it last longer by protecting it from dings and scratches. Varnishing is especially useful if you painted on a non-porous surface, like metal or glass. Posca paint doesn't penetrate into these non-porous surfaces, like the way it penetrates into paper or fabric, for example, which means Posca paints are really susceptible to scratching and flaking on non-porous surfaces. In my experience, depending on the specific type of non-porous surface, varnish might not protect the artwork completely, so your results may vary. But in general, it's probably worth giving your Posca art that extra layer of protection, especially if you want it to last as long as possible. Varnishing can also protect your artwork from exposure to UV rays, which can cause fading and discoloration over time. Varnishing can help slow down that fading process and also protects your artwork against the extremes of temperature and humidity. You can buy varnish in a convenient spray can or in a bottle where you have to brush it on. It's just a matter of personal preference. For protecting Posca art, I often use spray varnishes because you can easily get good coverage on a variety of surfaces, including 3D objects that have a lot of nooks and crannies that might be tedious to reach with a brush. I also find that it's easier to apply thin coats with a spray varnish, and it dries more quickly. When you varnish, make sure to do it in a well-ventilated area because you don't want to breathe in the fumes. I like to use spray varnish outside, but the downside of spraying outside is that you have to be careful that dust and debris don't blow onto your artwork. When you varnish, remember to apply several thin coats rather than one thick one, letting it fully dry in between each thin coat. And be sure to follow the instructions on the can or bottle. Varnishes come in different finishes, such as matte, satin, and gloss. They each have a different appearance. Gloss varnishes are the most shiny and can make colors look more deep and saturated. Matte varnishes are the exact opposite of shiny. They can almost seem dull in comparison, but they are preferable if you want a more natural-looking finish. Satin varnishes are somewhere in between. They're not as shiny and reflective as gloss varnishes, but they do have a medium sheen. The type of varnish you pick all depends on your own personal preference. I've had good results with Krylon Kamar varnish and Montana matte varnish. For brush-on varnishes, I like the ones offered by Liquitex and Golden. Whether or not you choose to varnish is entirely up to you. While it can help protect your Posca art, it is an optional step. If you do choose to varnish your Posca art, be sure to do a test first on scrap material so that there are no unpleasant surprises. When you read the reviews for different varnishes, they're often full of comments from people who unwittingly ruined their artwork by using the wrong varnish or by applying it incorrectly. So always do a test first to be on the safe side. People often wonder what is the best way to store Posca markers to make sure they last a long time. The official word from Posca is that it's okay to store your Posca paint markers in any direction, whether horizontally or vertically. The only exception are their brush nib markers, which must be stored horizontally. I store all of my Poscas horizontally in these handy trays. And the ones that don't fit, I store horizontally on my art table. Whichever way you store your Posca paint pens, make sure the caps are on tight, so the markers don't dry out. Sometimes the nibs of your Posca paint pens might need to be cleaned. For example, if you overlap your colors to blend them, then some of the other color will get onto your nib. To remove the extra color, simply run the Posca on a spare piece of paper until the extra color is all gone. Another solution is to dab your dirty Posca nib on a wet paper towel, then dab it on a dry paper towel. Or you can remove the nib entirely and soak it in water, or hold it under running water and rub it with your fingers to fully flush it out. Dab the nib dry on a paper towel, then put it back into the marker and reactivate it. The paint might come out watery at first, as the paint mixes with the water that's still in the nib, but as more paint flows into the nib, it should become more opaque and work as usual. Almost all of the Posca nibs are removable, except for the mopper, brush tip, and extra fine tip, PC1MR. In my experience, Posca nibs are quite durable and last a long time. With that said, I do mainly use them on surfaces that are relatively smooth. But if you regularly paint on rough, textured surfaces, your nibs could experience some wear and tear. If that happens to your PC3M or PC5M markers, the good news is that the nibs are reversible. If the nib becomes damaged, just plug it out like this, rotate it, and slide it back in. So easy! This doesn't work for the other types of Poscas though. Only the PC3M and PC5M have reversible nibs. But for most of the other nib types, Posca does sell replacement nibs for a very affordable price. Although, at least here in the US, they're not widely available, so you may have to hunt around for them online or inquire at your local art supply store. Posca paint pens are not officially refillable, and Posca doesn't sell refills. But if your marker runs out of paint and the barrel and nib are still in good condition, you might want to keep using it. In that case, you can try refilling it with a different brand of paint. First, I'll show you how to do it, and then we'll talk about paint brands. This can be a bit messy, so put down a spare towel first. Uncap your marker and use your hands or a pair of pliers to remove the top from your Posca paint pen, rotating in a clockwise direction. In the US, you've probably heard the phrase lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, but that doesn't apply to Poscas, so you'll need to do the opposite. The top has two parts. Sometimes they come off together, but sometimes the second part stays stuck, so you need to pluck it out. This is pretty easy. Just keep note of which end should be facing upwards. Once the top is off, carefully pour in your paint a little at a time, keeping a close eye on it so that you don't overfill it. Then screw the top back on. Shake and reprime your marker, and then you're good to go. The biggest hurdle with refilling Posca paint markers is color matching. Since different brands have different formulations for their colors, you just have to accept that the colors won't be exactly the same, but you can get pretty close. Refilling a black Posca or a white Posca is a lot easier because you don't have to worry about color matching. As for brands, one option is to buy Montana Paint refills, which is a high-quality paint that is designed for paint markers. It's available in 36 colors and costs around $10 for 30 milliliters. One benefit of Montana Paint refills is that the paint is matte, so it's similar in appearance to Posca paint. The other alternatives we're about to discuss have a more satin or glossy sheen, but on the other hand, they're a little bit cheaper than Montana Paint refills. Golden High Flow acrylic paint shares a similar consistency to Posca paint. There are 49 colors that come in 30 milliliter bottles for between $6 to $10. Acrylic inks are another option. For example, Liquitex acrylic inks are available in 55 colors. They come in 30 milliliter bottles for around $4 to $8. Both of these are considered artist-quality paints, but they won't behave exactly the same as Posca paints in terms of appearance, matte versus shiny, as well as coverage and adhesion to different surfaces. So just keep in mind that if you do refill your Poscas with acrylic ink or high-flow acrylics, you need to do so with a spirit of experimentation. Keep an open mind and be sure to test first to see how these paints work on different materials and whether you like the way it looks. Whichever brand you choose, just remember that if you want to refill your Posca markers, then you need a thin paint with a super low viscosity that flows easily. A thicker paint won't work well in a paint marker because it won't want to come out. So now it's time to put your Poscas to use. If you're looking for some ideas, check out my step-by-step tutorial about how to use Posca markers to create these colorful detailed rock mandalas. It's way easier than you might think. See you there!